He adopted the most loathed dog in the shelter. No one anticipated what followed. He walked into the facility under a torrential downpour. A middle-aged man with weary eyes and a soft voice. When the worker asked which dog he was looking for, he replied without hesitation, "The most hated one, the one nobody wants." Her hand froze over the paperwork. "Are you sure?" He nodded. A minute later, a German shepherd with a broken ear and vacant eyes stood before him. The dog didn't bark or growl, he just stared. And in that gaze, the man recognized something painfully familiar. His name was Shadow. He had spent 3 years in a concrete cage, surviving 3 failed adoption attempts. The last owner received 42 stitches. After that, they decided not to show the dog to anyone. But Frank Sullivan insisted. He silently signed all the papers without asking questions. "Do you understand what you're getting into?" asked the girl from the shelter. "I do." His voice was raspy, as if the dust of distant roads lived within it. Sometimes, a chance is deserved by the one who has stopped waiting. Shadow remained motionless when the cage door swung open. Only his eyes flickered slightly, warm, amber, exhausted. Frank crouched down and slowly extended his palm. "I won't force you. Everything is on your terms." The silence lasted an eternity. Then the dog, as if weighing something, stood up and carefully placed a paw on the man's hand. In that moment, even the wind in the shelter corridor seemed to freeze. 30 minutes later, Frank was driving his old pickup down the highway, and in the back seat, the German shepherd shivered, watching the streetlights slip away through the window. The cabin smelled of wet fur, gasoline, and something new, freedom. At their house, Shadow hesitated for a long time before exiting. Every loud noise made him flinch. Frank didn't rush him, he set down a bowl of water and nodded. "The place is yours, choose for yourself." At night, Shadow hid under the table. He didn't eat, didn't drink, just tracked every movement of the human. But in the morning, when Frank pretended to be asleep, the bowl was found empty. The first step had been taken. The first week felt like sitting on a powder keg. Shadow lived somewhere nearby, but not with him. He ate only at night, drank when Frank left for work, and hid at any knock on the window. It seemed fear was etched into his bones. Frank didn't hurry him. He simply lived, reading books aloud in the living room, putting coffee on the stove, sometimes purposely humming something quiet so the dog could hear his voice. Military service had taught him patience and the understanding that trust cannot be commanded. On the 5th day, he noticed tiny round scars on the dog's flank, looking like cigarette burns. Frank sat on the floor for a long time staring at these marks, and finally whispered, "Someone tried to kill what was alive inside you, but you survived." That night, for the first time, Shadow didn't hide. He lay at the entrance to the room, wary, but closer than before. "Progress, buddy," Frank said, smiling. Small, but honest. On the 7th day, a miracle happened. The man woke up from a light touch. Shadow was standing nearby and placed a paw on his arm, just like back at the shelter. "Hello, friend," Frank whispered, feeling something tighten inside. "Now it's for real." Gradually, the house came to life. The dog began going out for walks and stopped fearing the open door. Sometimes, hearing a loud sound, he would freeze, but seeing that Frank was calm, he would sit nearby and exhale quietly. One evening, there was a knock at the door. On the threshold stood the local police chief, Robert Thompson, a tall, gaunt man with a tired face. "Sullivan," he said, eyeing the dog. "You know who you're living with, right?" Frank nodded. "I know. With someone others abandoned. This dog bit 3 people. One child almost lost an arm." Thompson squinted. "Aren't you scared?" Frank looked at Shadow, who sat by his leg calmly and alertly, like a soldier at his post. "I fear silence, not those who have survived too much." When the policeman left, Shadow approached and laid his head on his owner's knees. In this simple gesture was everything: trust, gratitude, a promise. Later, while taking apart the old collar, Frank found a metal tag, worn down, with the stamped letters USMC K9. A military tag. The man's heart clenched. "Is it really you?" he whispered. "You served." He flipped the plate and saw a partially erased name. Lieutenant M. Ben. The name was familiar. Michael Bennett, the very man who had served with him many years ago, and who, after discharge, had gone into the private dog training business. Frank sat by the window for a long time, looking out at the dark yard. The dog quietly walked up and buried his nose in his palm. "We both have too many shadows," he whispered. "But it seems we aren't alone anymore." From then on, Frank had no doubts. Shadow was a former military dog. Everything about him spoke of it. The precision of his movements, his reaction to commands, his attentiveness to sounds. He listened not with his ears, but with his body. But a question gave him no peace. How did a combat dog end up in a shelter? The answer came unexpectedly. While walking along the embankment, Frank heard a child's voice. "That's that mean dog." He turned around. Before him stood a boy of about 8 with disheveled hair and a perpetual smile. "His name is Shadow," Frank replied. "And he isn't mean. He's just seen too much." "I'm Lucas," the boy introduced himself. "Lucas Bennett." Frank froze. His heart felt like it hit a wall. Bennett. The surname on the tag. "Do you know who trained him?" he asked, trying to speak calmly. The boy nodded. "Yes, my dad, he used to be in the military. We lived with this dog, but then Dad said he broke, and one day he was just gone." Frank lowered himself to a squat. His gaze met Shadow's eyes. The dog stood motionless, but the fur on his neck rose when a tall man in a crisp uniform appeared nearby. "Lucas." The voice was harsh and commanding. "Get away from that dog." Shadow froze. His muscles tensed, his eyes darkened. Frank immediately realized this man was Michael Bennett, his former fellow soldier. "Michael," he said quietly, "long time no see." Bennett turned pale. "What are you doing with that creature? He's dangerous. He should have been put down." "He isn't dangerous," Frank replied. "He's saving himself." Bennett sneered. "You were always naive, Sullivan. Some dogs don't change, just like people." Frank gripped the leash. Shadow trembled but didn't growl, only watching his former master with an expression mixing fear and memory. When Bennett led his son away, Shadow sank heavily to the ground. He didn't howl or whine, just breathed raggedly for a long time, as if holding back pain. Frank sat beside him. "Now I know why you were afraid of men." He ran his palm over his neck. "You were beaten by the one you served." That night, the nightmares returned. Afghanistan, sand, an explosion, a dead partner, a dog, the one Frank hadn't managed to save. And suddenly, amidst the dust, Shadow's gaze appeared, the same weary look begging for salvation. He woke up in a cold sweat. Shadow was sitting nearby, unmoving. "We both see the same thing, don't we?" he whispered. "Only you stay silent." Days flowed into a familiar rhythm. Frank started writing reports again, keeping a diary where he noted every detail. Day 37, Shadow approached the neighbor's boy without aggression for the first time. Day 49, my night terrors. He came, placed his paw on me, calmed me down. Day 62, reacts to the sound of a bell like a command. I think he was a sapper. One evening, a car pulled up to their house. The same policeman, Thompson, stepped out. "The city council is discussing closing the shelter," he said. "Bennett is on the budget committee now. I'm sure you'll want to speak." "I'll come," Frank answered. "And I'll bring Shadow." Martha, the neighbor, hearing the conversation, shook her head. "It's going to be loud." "Let it be," Frank chuckled. Sometimes the truth needs to be spoken aloud. A week later, he actually appeared at the meeting with Shadow at his heel. The dog sat calmly. His eyes gleamed under the lamplights. People whispered, "That's the dangerous one, the one that bit." When it was his turn to speak, Frank stood up. I'm not asking for pity, he began. I'm asking for a second chance for those who have already been written off as hopeless. He spoke about Shadow, about the fear and pain, but also about loyalty, about the silence in which trust is born. This dog was a soldier. He saved people, and then he was abandoned. And all he needed was someone who wouldn't turn away. The hall fell silent. Even Bennett found no words. Only little Lucas quietly walked up and sat next to the dog. He isn't mean, the boy said. He just remembers. After the meeting, life seemed to return to its usual course. Only something had shifted, as if the air had become heavier. Frank noticed that a strange car was stopping near his house more frequently. At night, scratches appeared on the fence, and once someone threw a stone through the window with a note, "Put the beast down before it's too late." He didn't tell the police, he didn't want to raise a commotion again, but Shadow understood everything without words. The dog became more wary, patrolling the yard more often, listening to every rustle. That look Frank hoped never to see again returned to his eyes, fear mixed with a readiness to protect. One evening, while rain was pouring, Frank was returning from the store. In his hands was a bag with food and bread. In the headlights, he saw a shadow at the gate. Someone was tampering with the lock. The man dropped the bag and ran. But before he could shout, Shadow flew out of the darkness. Like lightning. With a dull growl, a scream was heard. Then silence. Frank ran up. A man in a hood lay on the ground. Shadow held him by the arm but wasn't biting. He simply pinned him to the earth. The man twitched, and Frank realized it was Michael Bennett. "Have you lost your mind?" Frank exhaled. "I just wanted to take him back." "His mind," Bennett shouted. "You have no idea what kind of dog this is." Frank stood in disbelief. "I know," he said quietly. "And I'm not giving him up regardless." The police arrived in 10 minutes. Thompson found out about everything and came himself. Shadow sat next to Frank, not taking his eyes off Michael. "This man broke the gate lock," Thompson said. "We have everything recorded." Bennett remained silent. Only later, near the car, did he say, "That dog killed my brother." The world seemed to collapse. Later at the station, Bennett told everything. Several years ago, during an operation in Afghanistan, his brother Jason came under fire. Shadow, then a service dog under his command, reacted differently than expected. He got scared of an explosion and rushed forward. In the chaos, he was blamed for the operation's failure. Since then, Bennett had hated him. "I couldn't forgive," he admitted. "Not the dog, not myself." Frank was silent for a long time. "He isn't to blame. You know that. We were both there. I saw what happened." He exhaled. "That was a human error, not an animal's." The court fined Bennett for trespassing, but the story quickly spread through the town. People began whispering again. Letters arrived in Frank's mail, some with support, others with threats. He held on for Shadow's sake. Shadow became different, more confident. When Frank lost heart, the dog would sit nearby, resting his head on his knees, as if saying, "Hold on, you're my rescuer." "Although everyone thinks I'm saving you," Frank told him. In the spring, they were invited to a veterans meeting. There, Shadow wore his old tag again for the first time. People approached, recognized him, patted him on the shoulder. Some wept. One man said, "This dog once dragged me out of a basement under fire. I thought he was long gone." Frank smiled. "He is alive and remembers all of us." After the meeting, Thompson proposed an idea to create a rehabilitation program for military dogs decommissioned after service. "You could be its face," he said. "You and Shadow." Frank initially refused, but then realized it made sense. Not just for him, but for everyone who believes the past can be rewritten. They started small, visits to the shelter. Shadow sat calmly while children petted him behind the ear. In every movement, a careful tenderness was felt, and someone would inevitably whisper, "He isn't scary, he's kind." Thus, the name of the most hated dog became a symbol of a second chance. But one day, everything nearly ended. Late one evening, returning home after a meeting, Frank noticed smoke. His house was burning. Neighbors were calling the firefighters, but inside, amidst the flames, was someone. Old Mrs. May, the neighbor who lived alone. Without hesitation, Frank rushed to the door, but the flames wouldn't let him near. Then Shadow jumped through the fire. Through the smoke, Frank screamed and prayed until he heard coughing. The dog appeared from the darkness, completely black from soot, but alive. Behind him was May, leaning on the wall. Shadow was holding her coat with his teeth, dragging her to the exit. When the firefighters pulled them both out, the crowd applauded, and Frank knelt beside the dog and cried. "You saved a life again," he whispered. "Just like back then. Only now, no one will blame you." Several days passed after the fire. Frank's house was partially burned but miraculously preserved. Neighbors helped restore the roof. And local volunteers brought food, clothes, and a new place to sleep. But the main miracle for everyone was Shadow. The dog lay under veterinary observation for a long time. Burns on his paws, mild respiratory burns, and exhaustion. But his eyes were alive again. Frank visited him every day, sat by the cage, reading aloud, the same voice, the same patience. And every time he stood up, Shadow would whine quietly, as if asking, "Stay a little longer. Be patient, buddy," Frank would say. "We'll go home again." One day, May, the very neighbor he had saved, came to the vet, small, gray-haired, with burns on her hands. She brought a bag of treats and said, "He is an angel. I wouldn't be alive if not for him." Frank smiled. "No, May. He just wanted to prove that the past doesn't decide who you become tomorrow." When Shadow finally returned home, the town already knew his history. The local newspaper published an article. The dog that was feared had become a hero. Journalists came to conduct interviews. Children wrote letters with words of gratitude. On one of the letters, written in a large, childish hand, it said, "You are the bravest dog in the world. I want to be like you." Frank hung this letter above the fireplace. Since then, their lives changed. He and Shadow began traveling to shelters, schools, and veteran centers. Children petted the dog, listened to the story, and adults cried, not from pity, but from hope. "Do you see what you've done?" Frank would say, sitting down on the grass nearby. "Now you are loved." Shadow would lay his head on his knees, exhaling, and in that sound, one could hear, "I was just doing what I had to." And only occasionally at night did Frank notice the dog flinching in his sleep. Then he would quietly place a hand on his back. "Everything is fine. We are home." 6 months passed. At the City Festival of Heroes, Frank was presented with a medal for courage and valor, but he merely shrugged and hung the award on Shadow's collar. "Yours," he said. "You earned it." The crowd applauded. Among the spectators stood Michael Bennett, without his uniform, without his pride. He approached, took off his hat, and said, "I'm sorry, you were right. He isn't a beast, he is a soldier." Frank nodded. "No one is born a monster, Michael. It's just that someone has to give a chance to prove it." Bennett crouched down, cautiously extending his palm. Shadow, after a short pause, stepped forward and touched his hand with his nose. The crowd held its breath, and then someone began to weep. A year went by. The house was rebuilt, and the garden bloomed again. The wind carried the scent of fresh grass and morning coffee. Frank sat on the porch, and beside him was Shadow, already gray around the muzzle, but with that same attentive gaze. They started every morning the same way. A short walk, a cup of coffee, silence. Frank no longer feared this silence. Life now lived within it. Sometimes Lucas came over, that boy, Bennett's son. He ran around the yard, played with Shadow, and laughed. And every time Frank looked at them, his heart filled with warmth. "He's your friend now, isn't he?" the boy asked once. Frank smiled. "I think he is now ours," for everyone who was once afraid to start over. When the sun dipped towards sunset, Shadow would lift his head, looking into the distance, as if waiting for something. "Everything is all right, boy," Frank whispered, stroking his neck. "We did what we had to." That evening, he put the tag back on, old, worn, with the inscription USMC K9. It clinked in the wind, like a reminder that even the most broken souls can become a light for others. Frank looked at the dog and said, "Remember how I said you deserved a second chance?" He smiled. "I think it was my chance too." Shadow looked up, his eyes reflecting the sun. And in that instant, everything was simple. A man and a dog, two survivors who found each other not by accident. And then they just sat silently, calmly, as if their whole world had finally stopped rushing.